The entire town of Willow Creek gathered as their beloved German Shepherd, Sadie, gave birth to not 5 or 7 but 16 newborns in one extraordinary night. Neighbors called it a miracle litter. The local paper sent a reporter, and the house overflowed with celebration. But within 48 hours, the joy turned to cold, paralyzing dread. The newborns didn't cry like puppies. They didn't move like puppies, and their appearance was all wrong. Uniformly black, unnaturally numerous, with a strange scuttling quality. Sadie grew increasingly distressed, tears streaming down her face like a human mother in mourning, protecting them with a fierce desperation as though she knew a terrible secret no one else could face. When the vet finally arrived to examine the litter, his face drained of all color. He stepped back from the blanket, his hands trembling, and whispered words that turned the celebration into a nightmare. "These aren't puppies at all." And what they really were left Joseph and Elizabeth terrified and heartbroken. As you're listening, share in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you'd like more stories like this, feel free to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss any. The night had been long, punctuated by anxious glances at the clock and Sadie's labored breathing. The German Shepherd lay in the corner of the farmhouse living room, her powerful body trembling with contractions. Elizabeth knelt beside her, whispering encouragement while Joseph paced near the window. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, knowing Sadie was carrying a large litter. The veterinary ultrasound had suggested 8, maybe 10 puppies at most. This was already considered exceptional for a first-time mother. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the silence. The first newborn had arrived, dark and slick. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "It's here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Joseph rushed over, kneeling beside them. Sadie immediately began cleaning the tiny form, her instincts taking over despite her exhaustion. The couple exchanged relieved smiles, their hands clasped together tightly. One down, they thought. Several more to go. But Sadie's labor continued relentlessly. 3 newborns, then 5, then 7. Each arrival brought fresh amazement. Joseph counted them aloud while Elizabeth arranged clean towels and checked on Sadie's condition. The pile of squirming bodies grew larger, filling the makeshift birthing area with movement and sound. "This is incredible," Joseph murmured, watching Sadie pull each newborn close with gentle care. They had witnessed dog births before, but nothing like this. The sheer number was overwhelming. Hours dragged on, yet Sadie persisted. Her body shook with exhaustion, her breathing ragged, but she pressed forward. 9 newborns, then 11, then 13. Elizabeth began to worry, checking Sadie's gums for signs of distress. "How many more?" she asked, her voice edged with concern. Joseph shook his head in disbelief, unable to answer. The birthing area now looked impossibly crowded. Finally, when the 16th tiny form slipped into the world, the room fell into stunned silence. 16. The number seemed impossible, almost mythical. Sadie collapsed heavily against the blankets, her chest heaving, her eyes closing in utter depletion. She curled protectively around the massive litter, her maternal instincts overriding her exhaustion. Elizabeth and Joseph sat back, speechless, staring at what could only be described as a biological miracle. By morning, word had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Neighbors arrived at the door with casseroles and congratulations, eager to witness the historic litter for themselves. 16 German Shepherd puppies. One elderly woman gasped, peering through the doorway. "I've never heard of such a thing." The local newspaper sent a photographer. Children pressed their faces against the window, giggling with delight. Joseph and Elizabeth accepted the attention with tired but proud smiles, their beloved Sadie now a local celebrity. Yet beneath the celebration, something deeply wrong lurked. Elizabeth was the first to notice. The newborns were uniformly unnaturally black, not a single splash of the tan or brown markings typical of German Shepherd puppies. Their cries weren't the high-pitched mewling of newborn dogs, but something sharper, more chittering. And their movements, they didn't tumble and crawl like puppies learning to navigate the world. They scuttled with unsettling coordination, their tiny bodies moving in ways that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. The celebration continued through the second day, though the initial euphoria had begun to wear thin. Elizabeth found herself standing at the kitchen counter, staring at her untouched coffee as laughter drifted in from the living room where Joseph entertained yet another group of well-wishers. She should have been in there with them, basking in the attention, but something kept pulling her back to the birthing area, to Sadie, to those 16 writhing black forms that seemed to multiply in her peripheral vision. When she finally returned to check on them, her breath caught. In daylight, the wrongness was undeniable. The newborns had grown overnight, impossibly fast for creatures less than 48 hours old. Their bodies were sleek and elongated, their heads tapering to pointed snouts that looked nothing like the broad, noble shape of German Shepherd puppies. Elizabeth knelt slowly, her knees protesting against the hardwood floor, and leaned closer. The sounds they made sent ice through her veins. Not the gentle squeaking of hungry puppies, but a chittering, almost insect-like clicking that rose and fell in disturbing harmony. "Joseph," she called out, her voice tight. "Joseph, come here. Now." He appeared in the doorway, his smile fading as he registered her expression. "What's wrong?" "Look at them." She gestured toward the squirming mass. "Really look." Joseph crouched beside her, his brow furrowing. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Elizabeth could see the conflict playing across his face, the desire to see puppies warring with the evidence before his eyes. The creatures moved with a scuttling coordination that was profoundly unnatural, piling over one another in a dense, shifting mound of uniform blackness. Their tiny claws clicked against the blanket with each movement, sharp and rapid. "They're dark puppies," Joseph said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Some breeds are born completely black before their markings come in. I read about it online last night. Solid black German Shepherds are rare, but they exist." 16 of them. Elizabeth's voice cracked. "All solid black. Look at their faces, Joe. Look at their snouts." "It's probably just because they're newborns," he insisted, standing abruptly as though distance might make the sight more bearable. "Everything looks weird when they're this young. Remember when Sarah was born? She looked like a wrinkled old man for the first week." But Elizabeth couldn't look away. She watched as one of the creatures opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth far too developed for a newborn of any canine species. Its eyes, which should have been sealed shut for another week at least, were already beginning to crack open, revealing an unsettling brightness behind the thin membrane. Beside them, Sadie whimpered, a sound Elizabeth had never heard from the normally stoic shepherd. The dog's tears had not stopped flowing, leaving wet tracks through her tan fur, and her entire body trembled with a tension that seemed close to breaking. "Joe, something is very wrong here," Elizabeth whispered. "We need to call Dr. Harrison. Today. Right now." Joseph ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. "And tell him what? That our dog's puppies look weird? He'll think we're hysterical. Let's just give it another day or two. They might just need time to develop normally." But even as he said it, both of them knew. Time wasn't going to fix this. Time was only going to make whatever was happening worse. The 16 black bodies continued their unsettling dance, and Sadie's mournful eyes begged them to understand something she couldn't voice. A warning that came too late, a horror that had already begun. By the third day, the visitors had stopped coming. Word had spread through Willow Creek in whispers rather than celebrations, and the phone calls that had flooded their home now came sporadically, tentative, filled with careful questions that Joseph deflected with forced cheerfulness. But inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere had turned suffocating. And at the center of it all was Sadie. Elizabeth had never seen an animal cry before. Not truly cry, the way humans did. She'd seen dogs whimper, seen them paw at their eyes when irritated, but this was different. Sadie's tears flowed constantly now, streaming down her face in genuine rivulets that soaked into her fur and dripped onto the blankets. The shepherd lay curved around her litter in a rigid crescent, her body tense as a coiled spring, and the sounds emerging from her throat were unlike anything Elizabeth had heard in their 5 years together. Low, guttural whines that seemed to come from somewhere deep in Sadie's chest, vibrating with a frequency that made Elizabeth's teeth ache. The dog barely ate anymore, refusing the special meals Joseph prepared, only lifting her head to lap weakly at water before returning to her vigil. Her eyes, once warm and trusting, had taken on a haunted quality. Wide and unblinking, perpetually wet, darting between the squirming black mass and any human who dared approach. "Sadie, girl," Elizabeth murmured, extending her hand slowly, palm up. "Let me check on you. I just want to make sure you're okay." The response was immediate and terrifying. Sadie's lips peeled back from her teeth in a snarl that seemed to split her face, revealing canines that looked suddenly enormous, predatory. The growl that erupted was primal, resonating through the room with such intensity that Elizabeth stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the beloved family pet who slept at the foot of their bed, who played fetch with their children, who had never shown an ounce of aggression in her entire life. "Jesus Christ!" Joseph breathed from the doorway, his face pale. "She nearly went for you." Elizabeth pressed her back against the wall, her hands shaking. But even as fear flooded her system, something else crystallized in her mind, a terrible understanding. She watched Sadie's body language, the way the dog immediately softened after her display, her head lowering, another sob-like whine escaping her throat. The shepherd's eyes found Elizabeth's, and in that moment, the message was unmistakable. "She's not trying to hurt us," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's trying to protect us." "Protect us?" Joseph's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "From what? They're newborn puppies, Elizabeth. They can barely move." But Elizabeth shook her head, unable to tear her gaze from Sadie's tormented face. "No, she's not protecting them from us. She's protecting us from them." The realization settled over her like a shroud. "Joe, she knows what they are. She's known from the moment they were born. That's why she's crying. It's not pain. It's not exhaustion." Elizabeth's voice broke. "It's grief. And it's fear." Sadie released another low, mournful sound, her tears flowing faster now and gently, so carefully. She used her nose to nudge the creatures closer to her belly, tucking them beneath her as though trying to contain them, to keep them from spreading outward. Her entire body trembled with the effort of maintaining her protective stance, caught between her maternal instinct to nurture what her body had produced and her deeper, more primal knowledge that something was catastrophically wrong. The 16 black forms chittered and scuttled beneath their mother's watchful despair, growing larger by the hour, and Elizabeth finally understood. They needed help. They needed answers. and they needed them before whatever was happening in their living room grew beyond anyone's ability to control. The transformation accelerated overnight with a speed that defied nature. Elizabeth woke before dawn on the fourth day, drawn downstairs by an instinct she couldn't name. The living room was dark except for the pale glow of early morning seeping through the curtains, but she could hear them, the clicking, chittering chorus that had replaced the soft mewling of newborn puppies. She flicked on the lamp with trembling fingers, and what she saw made her stomach lurch. They had doubled in size. What had been palm-sized forms were now nearly the length of her forearm, their bodies sleek and disturbingly muscular beneath fur so black it seemed to absorb the light around them. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. This wasn't possible. No mammal grew this rapidly. No puppy, no matter how well fed, could achieve this kind of growth in less than a week. She forced herself to move closer, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. The details were worse up close, so much worse. Their claws, which had been barely visible pinpricks days ago, were now fully formed and wickedly sharp, curved like talons and clicking against each other as the creatures climbed over one another in their constant, restless movement. One of them paused near the edge of the blanket, and Elizabeth saw its paw clearly. 5 elongated digits, each tipped with a black claw that looked capable of shredding fabric, skin, anything soft. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature's head swiveled toward her voice with unsettling precision. Its eyes were open now. Fully open, bright and aware in a way that newborn animals' eyes should never be. They gleamed with an intelligence that made Elizabeth's skin crawl, reflecting the lamplight with an eerie, almost phosphorescent quality. The face had elongated further, the snout now unmistakably rodent-like, ending in a twitching pink nose surrounded by long, sensitive whiskers. When it opened its mouth, she saw rows of needle-sharp teeth, already fully erupted, designed for tearing and gnawing. The movement of the creatures was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Puppies tumbled and wobbled, their legs uncoordinated and clumsy as they learned to navigate their new world. These things scuttled with horrible efficiency, their bodies low to the ground, moving in quick, jerking motions that reminded Elizabeth of cockroaches fleeing light. They piled atop one another in a writhing heap, then scattered and reformed, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested communication, cooperation, and collective intelligence. Joseph appeared behind her, his breath catching audibly. How did they? "I don't know." Elizabeth's voice was hollow. "But look at them, Joe. Really look. Those aren't dogs developing abnormally. Those aren't dogs at all." One of the creatures chose that moment to climb onto Sadie's back, its claws finding purchase in her fur. The shepherd flinched but didn't move, her tears flowing steadily, her body rigid with the effort of maintaining her protective position. The creature perched there for a moment, its bright eyes surveying the room with disturbing awareness, its whiskers twitching as it sampled the air. Then it opened its mouth and released a high-pitched squeak, not the cry of a puppy, but the unmistakable sound of a rat. The others responded immediately, their chittering intensifying, and Elizabeth watched in horror as they began to move with increased agitation, scrambling over Sadie's trembling form, their claws leaving faint scratches in her fur. They were coordinating, communicating, growing stronger and bolder with each passing hour. "We're calling Dr. Harrison," Elizabeth said, her voice suddenly firm with desperate resolve. "Right now. I don't care if it's 5 in the morning. This can't wait another day." The phone call to Dr. Harrison had bought them time. He promised to come by that afternoon, but it couldn't stop the neighbors from talking. By mid-morning, 3 separate visitors had appeared at the door, each wearing expressions of poorly concealed curiosity mixed with something darker. Margaret Chen from next door arrived first, carrying a casserole dish that Elizabeth suspected was merely an excuse. "I just wanted to check on Sadie," Margaret said brightly, already craning her neck to peer past Elizabeth into the house. "The kids have been asking about the puppies. They'd love to see them, maybe pick one out when they're ready." "Now's not a good time," Elizabeth interrupted, positioning herself to block the doorway more fully. "Sadie's still very protective. The vet said we shouldn't allow visitors until they're older." Margaret's smile faltered. "Oh, I thought I heard the Johnsons stopped by yesterday." "They did. Briefly." The lie came easier than Elizabeth expected. But Sadie got very agitated. "We can't risk it right now." From inside the house, a chorus of high-pitched chittering erupted, followed by Sadie's low, mournful whine. Margaret's eyes widened, her gaze darting toward the sound. "That's an unusual noise. Are you sure there?" "Thank you for the casserole," Elizabeth said firmly, accepting the dish and already closing the door. "We really appreciate it. I'll call you when things settle down." She shut the door before Margaret could respond, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched her neighbor stand on the porch for a long moment, her expression troubled, before finally retreating to her own yard. But Margaret didn't go inside. Instead, she pulled out her phone, and Elizabeth's stomach sank as she watched her neighbor's fingers fly across the screen. Joseph found her there an hour later, still standing guard by the window. "Tom Brewster just called," he said quietly, his face gray. "He wanted to know if the rat problem we're having is contagious. Asked if we'd had an exterminator out yet." Elizabeth closed her eyes. "Who told him? Does it matter?" Joseph's voice was brittle. "Half the town probably knows by now. Sarah called from school. Kids have been asking her why her family is keeping rats instead of puppies. She's mortified. She won't even come home." The isolation happened gradually and then all at once. By evening, their street was conspicuously empty. No children playing in yards, no neighbors walking dogs past their house, no friendly waves from passing cars. The Hendersons across the street had drawn their curtains, something Elizabeth had never seen them do during daylight hours. When Joseph ventured to the mailbox, he reported that conversation on the street had stopped abruptly, heads turning away, car doors closing just a little too quickly. The text messages were worse. Polite at first, then increasingly pointed. "Is everything okay with Sadie?" Turned into "people are saying those aren't puppies," which evolved into "you need to do something about this." One message from the HOA president made Joseph's hand shake. "Several residents have expressed concern about potential health hazards. We need to discuss this at the next meeting." Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table that night, her untouched dinner growing cold, and felt the weight of their new reality settling over her like a shroud. They had become pariahs in their own neighborhood, their miracle litter transformed into a source of whispered horror and speculation. Through the doorway, she could see Sadie lying in her corner, surrounded by 16 rapidly growing creatures that chittered and scuttled in the lamplight, their bright eyes gleaming with unnatural awareness. "We can't keep lying," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "And we can't make them disappear. So what do we do, Joe? What the hell do we do?" Joseph had no answer. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the unsettling chorus from the living room, the sound of something that should never have been born. Dr. Harrison arrived exactly at 2:00, his truck pulling into the driveway with a deliberate slowness that suggested reluctance. Elizabeth watched from the window as he sat there for a long moment, staring at the house, before finally gathering his medical bag and stepping out. He was a tall man in his 60s, with gray hair and steady hands that had delivered countless litters over his 40-year career. But as Elizabeth opened the door, she saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Apprehension. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "I know this is unusual." "Let me see them," he interrupted quietly, his professional mask firmly in place. But his eyes kept darting toward the living room, where the chittering had intensified at the sound of a stranger's voice. Joseph stood as they entered, his face haggard from sleepless nights. Sadie didn't move from her protective curl, but her lips pulled back in an immediate warning snarl, her tear-stained face twisting with both grief and aggression. Dr. Harrison stopped several feet away, his experienced gaze sweeping across the scene, and Elizabeth watched the color drain slowly from his weathered face. "How old did you say they were?" His voice was carefully neutral. 5 days, Joseph answered. "Almost 6. Dr. Harrison's jaw tightened. He set down his bag with deliberate care, then slowly crouched, making himself smaller, less threatening. The creatures responded by scattering briefly before regrouping, their movements unervingly coordinated. One climbed atop another, its long snout twitching, its bright eyes fixed on the veterinarian with disturbing intelligence. The vet pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, shining it across the mass of black bodies, and Elizabeth heard his sharp intake of breath. "Their eyes are fully open," he said, more to himself than to them. "Teeth fully erupted. Motor coordination far beyond." He stopped himself, his professional composure cracking. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I need you to answer some questions very carefully. Have you noticed any wild animal activity on your property recently? Any signs of burrowing, nesting, unusual droppings?" Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Joseph. "We found some holes near the barn," she admitted. "About 2 months ago. Joe filled them in." "What kind of holes?" "Burrows, maybe. We thought rabbits or groundhogs." Dr. Harrison's expression darkened. "And Sadie had access to that area? She could have been exposed to." He stopped again, standing abruptly and moving closer despite Sadie's escalating growls. He extended a gloved hand toward one of the creatures, and it responded by opening its mouth, revealing those needle-sharp teeth in a defensive hiss that sounded nothing like any canine Elizabeth had ever heard. The vet pulled back his hand, his face ashen. "Dear God," he whispered, "I need to examine one more closely. Can you help me separate just one from the group?" "Sadie won't allow it," Joseph said flatly. "She nearly bit Elizabeth yesterday." "Then I'll need you to restrain her. Gently but firmly." Dr. Harrison's voice had taken on an urgency that made Elizabeth's pulse quicken. "I need to confirm what I'm seeing before I can tell you what's happened here." They worked together, Joseph coaxing Sadie into a sitting position while Dr. Harrison used a towel to carefully lift one of the creatures away from the group. It squirmed violently in his grasp, its claws shredding the fabric, its mouth open in a continuous high-pitched squeal that made Elizabeth's teeth ache. Sadie lunged forward with a desperate whine, her tears flowing faster, but Joseph held her back, murmuring apologies. Dr. Harrison carried the struggling creature to the kitchen table, pinning it gently but firmly while he conducted his examination. Elizabeth couldn't see his face from where she stood, but she could see his hands trembling as they moved over the small body, checking teeth, paws, tail, bone structure. The silence stretched unbearably. Finally, he released the creature, letting it scuttle back toward its mother, and turned to face them. His expression told Elizabeth everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. This wasn't going to be a simple explanation. This wasn't going to be something they could fix. Dr. Harrison removed his gloves with meticulous care, dropping them into a medical waste bag he pulled from his kit. His hands continued to shake as he gripped the edge of the kitchen table, steadying himself. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the distant chittering from the living room and Sadie's low, mournful whining. Elizabeth found herself holding her breath, waiting for words she knew would shatter whatever remained of their normal life. "They are not puppies," Dr. Harrison said finally, his voice hoarse. "What Sadie gave birth to is a biological anomaly. Something I've only read about in veterinary journals, case studies from rural areas, freak occurrences that most professionals dismissed as impossible." He looked up, his eyes moving between Joseph and Elizabeth with something that looked like pity. "What you have in your home is evidence of cross-species impregnation." Joseph laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "That's not possible. Dogs can't breed with other species. You're saying Sadie mated with a large invasive rodent species," Dr. Harrison interrupted, his voice flat with the weight of certainty. "Most likely Ratus norvegicus, the Norway rat, or a closely related species. The burrows you found, the timing of Sadie's exposure, the rapid development cycle, the physical characteristics I just examined." He gestured toward the living room with a trembling hand. "Those aren't puppies with genetic abnormalities. Those are hybrid organisms. Part canine, part rodent. And they should never have been viable." Elizabeth felt the room tilt. She gripped the counter behind her, her knuckles white. How is that even possible? Different species can't, the chromosomes wouldn't. "They shouldn't," the vet agreed, his voice hollow. "But nature finds ways we don't understand, especially when invasive species occupy the same territory as domesticated animals. There have been documented cases, extremely rare, usually resulting in stillbirths or non-viable embryos. But Sadie's body somehow sustained them. All 16. He paused, his professional composure crumbling. "I've never seen anything survive like this. Never seen them develop this rapidly, this aggressively." Joseph sank into a chair, his face gray. "So what are we supposed to do? What can we do?" Dr. Harrison's silence was answer enough. Finally, he spoke, each word seeming to cost him. "These creatures are growing at an exponential rate. In another week, maybe 2, they'll be the size of full-grown rats. Possibly larger given their hybrid genetics. They have the pack mentality of rodents combined with what appears to be heightened aggression. Their teeth, their claws." He stopped, rubbing his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, these are not animals you can domesticate or control. They are a biological hazard." "You're saying we have to kill them," Elizabeth whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I'm saying they pose a danger to your family, to your community, and potentially to Sadie herself." Dr. Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. "The humane option, the only responsible option, is euthanasia. I can do it today, quickly and painlessly. Sadie would recover physically within weeks, emotionally perhaps longer, but—" "No." Joseph's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You can't ask us to do that. Look at her." He gestured toward the living room where Sadie lay curled around her impossible litter, her tears streaming, her body rigid with protective desperation. "She's their mother. She knows what they are and she's still protecting them. You're asking us to murder her children in front of her." "I'm asking you to prevent a catastrophe," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "If these creatures escape, if they begin breeding with either rat or dog populations, you could start an epidemic of hybrid organisms. The ecological impact alone. They're not creatures, Elizabeth heard herself say, surprised by the strength in her voice. They're Sadie's babies. And we're not killers. Dr. Harrison looked at them both for a long moment, his expression a mixture of frustration and understanding. Then you need to make them your responsibility. Secure them. Contain them. Because if I walk out of here and word spreads about what you're harboring, the county will step in. Animal control, health department, possibly even law enforcement. He picked up his bag, his movements heavy with defeat. I'll give you 48 hours to decide. But after that, I'm required by law to report this. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the house, and Elizabeth and Joseph were left staring at each other across the kitchen, the weight of an impossible choice crushing down on them both. The news leaked within hours. Elizabeth never discovered who spoke first, whether Dr. Harrison broke confidentiality out of genuine concern, or whether Margaret Chen's persistent phone calls finally extracted enough information to piece together the truth. By nightfall, their phones were ringing constantly, the messages shifting from curiosity to accusation to outright hostility. You're harboring vermin, one voicemail spat. Those things need to be destroyed before they infest the whole neighborhood. Another was more pointed. My children play in yards near yours. If those rat things escape and hurt someone, we're holding you personally responsible. Joseph stood at the kitchen window, watching as cars slowed deliberately in front of their house, occupants craning their necks to stare. Some pulled out phones, recording video, their faces twisted with morbid fascination and disgust. We've become a freak show, he said quietly. The local horror story parents will tell their kids. By morning, someone had spray-painted rat breeders across their mailbox in angry red letters. Elizabeth discovered it when she ventured out for the newspaper, her hands shaking as she tried unsuccessfully to wipe away the paint. Across the street, the Hendersons watched from behind their curtains, making no move to help or even acknowledge her. The isolation was complete now, transformed from uncomfortable avoidance into active hostility. The town meeting was called for that evening at the community center. Elizabeth and Joseph weren't explicitly invited, but the email thread, accidentally copied to them by someone's careless reply all, made their attendance a necessity. We need to discuss the Patterson situation before it becomes a public health crisis, the HOA president had written. Invasive species, potential disease vectors, property values. This requires immediate community action. They arrived to find the parking lot full, the meeting room packed beyond capacity. Familiar faces turned toward them as they entered, expressions ranging from fear to anger to something worse, righteous indignation. Margaret Chen sat in the front row, her arms crossed, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Tom Brewster stood near the back, shaking his head slowly as though their mere presence confirmed his worst suspicions. The HOA president, a severe woman named Patricia Blackwell, called the meeting to order with barely concealed fury. Let's address the elephant in the room, she began, her voice cutting through the nervous murmurs. Or rather, the rats. The Patterson family is currently housing 16 hybrid rodent organisms that pose a clear and present danger to our community. They're not dangerous, Joseph interrupted, standing despite Elizabeth's restraining hand on his arm. They're contained. They're under control. And they're Sadie's. They're an abomination, someone shouted from the back. The room erupted in agreement. Patricia raised her hand for silence. Dr. Harrison has confirmed that these creatures could potentially breed with local rodent populations, creating an invasive hybrid species. The ecological ramifications alone. Not to mention the diseases. Margaret interjected, her voice shrill. Rats carry hantavirus, leptospirosis, plague. What happens when those things grow to full size and escape? What happens when they bite someone's child? Sadie's never hurt anyone, Elizabeth said, finding her voice. She's their mother. She's keeping them contained, protecting us from them just as much as protecting them from. Your dog mated with a rat, Tom Brewster said flatly, his voice dripping with disgust. That's unnatural. Those things shouldn't exist, and you shouldn't be defending them. The room descended into chaos, voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and anger. Put them down. Call animal control. They're endangering our families. This is a health code violation. Sue them for property devaluation. The words crashed over Elizabeth like waves, drowning out reason, drowning out compassion, leaving only primal fear and mob mentality. Patricia's gavel finally restored order. The HOA is filing a formal complaint with the county health department tomorrow morning. You have until then to voluntarily euthanize those creatures. If you don't, the authorities will remove them, and possibly Sadie as well, by force. Her eyes were cold, unyielding. This is not negotiable. This is about protecting our community. They left through a gauntlet of hostile stares, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Outside, someone had placed a dead rat on their car windshield, its glassy eyes reflecting the streetlights. Elizabeth brushed it away with shaking hands, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed in front of their neighbors. Inside the car, Joseph gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. They want us to kill them, he whispered. The whole town wants us to be executioners. Elizabeth looked back at the community center, at the faces pressed against the windows, at the town that had turned against them. Then they don't know us at all. They sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, the house silent except for the chittering from the living room and the occasional creak of floorboards. A bottle of whiskey stood between them, mostly untouched, alongside a notepad covered in Elizabeth's frantic handwriting. Lists of options, each one crossed out, none of them viable. We could move, Joseph said for the 3rd time, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Pack up, take Sadie and them. Find somewhere remote where no one knows us. And go where? Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. What happens when they grow too large to contain? When they start breeding? Dr. Harrison was right about the ecological impact. We can't just unleash 16 hybrid organisms into the world and hope for the best. Joseph's fist came down on the table, rattling their glasses. So we kill them. We hold Sadie down and murder her children while she watches? That's your solution. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? His eyes were red-rimmed, desperate. Because I've been sitting here for hours listening to you list every reason why keeping them is impossible. But you won't commit to the alternative either. We're running out of time, Elizabeth. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see Sadie's reflection in the living room glass. The shepherd hadn't moved in hours, her body still curved protectively around her impossible litter, her tears creating dark, wet patches on the blankets. I keep thinking about Sarah, Elizabeth said quietly. About how she won't even come home because she's so ashamed. About the fact that those things are growing larger every day, getting stronger, and we have 2 children who live in this house. Sarah's staying at her friend's place out of embarrassment, not fear, Joseph countered. And those creatures have never shown aggression toward us, only when threatened. Yet, Elizabeth turned to face him. They haven't shown aggression yet. But we don't know what they'll become. We don't know if Sadie's maternal influence is the only thing keeping them docile. She moved back to the table, sinking into her chair. I look at Sadie and I see a mother's love, something pure and unconditional that transcends species, transcends logic. But I also see our children's faces, and I don't know how to choose between them. Joseph reached across the table, taking her hand. His palm was clammy, trembling. What if we don't have to choose? What if there's a middle path? What are you thinking? We build them a secure enclosure. Something permanent, isolated, escape-proof. On the far edge of our property, away from the house, away from the neighbors. His words came faster now, energized by the possibility. We give Sadie and her litter a space where they can exist safely without threatening anyone. We take full responsibility, monitoring them, containing them, ensuring they never breed or escape. Elizabeth wanted to dismiss it immediately, to point out the 1,000 ways it could fail. But something in the idea resonated, a solution that honored both their compassion and their duty. The town would still hate us. The HOA would fight it. We'd need permits, inspections, constant vigilance. I know. Joseph's grip on her hand tightened. But it's the only option that doesn't require us to become monsters or abandon our principles. We contain them, we care for them, and we live with the consequences of our choice. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling over them like a physical burden. In the living room, Sadie released a low, mournful sound, and one of the creatures responded with a soft chittering, a call and answer that spoke of bonds neither fully human nor fully animal. We'll need reinforced steel mesh, Elizabeth said finally, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Double-layered fencing, concrete foundations to prevent burrowing, temperature-controlled shelter for Sadie, security cameras, daily inspections. Joseph nodded, pulling the notepad toward him and beginning a new list. I'll call contractors in the morning. We can use the money from the college fund if we have to. The HOA will sue us. Let them. His jaw set with determination. We're not killers. And we won't abandon our dog when she needs us most. Elizabeth looked toward the living room one more time, at the German shepherd whose tears had never stopped flowing, whose love had proven stronger than biology or reason. Then we'd better get started. We've got less than 24 hours before the county shows up. The construction happened in a fever of desperate activity. Joseph called in favors from the few contractors who would still work with them, paying triple rates for emergency service. By dawn, trucks were rumbling onto their property, carrying reinforced steel mesh, concrete pylons, and industrial-grade fencing. Elizabeth worked alongside them, her hands blistered and aching, her mind focused on a single goal: creating a sanctuary strong enough to contain the impossible, spacious enough to honor a mother's love. The enclosure took shape at the far edge of their 10-acre property, nestled against the tree line where it would be invisible from the road. 20 feet by 30 feet. With walls extending 6 feet underground to prevent burrowing and 12 feet high to eliminate any possibility of escape. Double-layered steel mesh with gaps too small for even the smallest creature to squeeze through. A climate-controlled shelter for Sadie, insulated and weatherproof, with a security camera system that would allow them to monitor every corner remotely. When the county health inspector arrived with animal control officers at noon the next day, Elizabeth met them at the property line with a binder of permits, architectural plans, and veterinary consultation documents she'd compiled through the night. "Everything is legal and properly secured," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "You're welcome to inspect the facility." The inspector walked the perimeter twice, testing locks, examining welds, checking foundation depths. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Elizabeth caught the grudging respect in his eyes when he finally nodded. It meets code. More than meets it, actually. But you understand you're accepting full legal liability for anything that happens. We understand, Joseph said, appearing beside Elizabeth. They're our responsibility. We won't fail them. Moving Sadie and her litter was the hardest part. The shepherd resisted at first, her growls turning to panicked whines as they attempted to guide her toward the new enclosure. But when Elizabeth carried one of the creatures ahead, Sadie's maternal instinct overrode her fear. She followed, her tears flowing freely, her body trembling as she watched Joseph and Elizabeth carefully transport each of the 16 hybrid forms to their new home. The enclosure was more than a cage. It was a habitat. Soft bedding, elevated platforms for Sadie to rest while observing her litter, feeding stations, enrichment items. Elizabeth had designed it with the help of an exotic animal specialist from 3 counties over, someone who understood that containment didn't have to mean cruelty. When the last creature was settled and Sadie had inspected every corner, the shepherd finally lay down, curling around her impossible family with a visible release of tension. Her tears continued, but something in her eyes had shifted. Not happiness, perhaps, but a fragile peace. The town never forgave them. The lawsuit from the HOA dragged on for months before being dismissed. Property values on their street dropped, and 3 families moved away within the year. Sarah eventually came home, though she never invited friends over. The Pattersons became Willow Creek's cautionary tale, their names spoken in whispers, their isolation absolute. But on quiet evenings, Elizabeth and Joseph would walk to the enclosure and watch Sadie with her strange brood. The creatures had grown to their full size, larger than rats, smaller than dogs, something entirely new in the world. They moved with eerie coordination, their bright eyes intelligent and watchful, but they never tested the barriers. And Sadie, faithful Sadie, remained their constant guardian, her tears having finally dried, replaced by a vigilant maternal devotion that transcended species and reason. "Do you regret it?" Joseph asked one twilight as they stood side by side, watching Sadie nuzzle one of her hybrid offspring. Elizabeth thought about the friends they'd lost, the community standing they'd sacrificed, the financial burden they would carry for years. Then she looked at Sadie's face, at the fierce love still burning in those expressive brown eyes, and understood what they had truly learned in those terrifying days. Family wasn't defined by blood or biology or societal acceptance. It was defined by the choice to love unconditionally, to protect the vulnerable even when the world demanded abandonment, to honor bonds that defied explanation. "No," she said finally, taking Joseph's hand. "I don't regret it at all." In the enclosure, Sadie lifted her head, her gaze meeting Elizabeth's across the distance. For just a moment, something passed between them. Understanding, gratitude, a shared recognition of the sacrifice love sometimes demanded. Then the shepherd returned her attention to her impossible children, and the Pattersons walked back toward their house, forever changed by the lesson their dog had taught them about the boundless nature of a mother's heart. Thanks for being here, and if you enjoyed this story, check out the next video waiting for you right now.